turn it over to you, Rachel. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that introduction. I'm going to share some slides and let's do a check, make sure this is all coming up okay. How is that looking?
That looks great.
Okay, perfect. All right, I hate to minimize folks because I really love being able to see people as I'm talking. But I'm going to make sure I don't I'm not missing anything. So thank you, Hannah. Thank you for that warm welcome and just the opportunity to be part of one of these workshops, one of these sessions with InnovateUS. If this is your first one, or if this is maybe like more than one that you've attended, I just cannot speak highly enough about the sessions that are offered. So do sign up for them. They are really fantastic. So welcome, everyone. It's so great to see so many people here today. I definitely recognize some names and some faces. They were coming in quite quickly, and so I don't even want to know what the number is. I'm going to try to minimize my my nervousness with that. But I really appreciate you being here today for this session on applying trauma-informed design to improve government services. And since we are recording, I just also want to extend a welcome to those who might be watching this at a later date. Okay, I want to give you a sense of our flow for this session. So right now, of course, we're in the welcome part right now, and then I'll transition to talking about what to expect. I'll share a bit about myself and my background in this work, and then offer some notes around hope and care. I'll then start to get into the core parts of the workshop and talk about trauma, trauma-informed care, and how trauma shows up in our work, especially in government services. I'll share some trauma responsive practices, a few closing thoughts, and ways that you can stay engaged with this work. And my goal, as Hannah said, my goal is to really have at least 30 minutes. So we may have a little bit more than that, might have hopefully not less than that at the end, so we can field any questions or any just thoughts that you want to share. So in talking about trauma, it's really important to give you all a sense of what to expect in the next 90 minutes. So first, I really want to encourage you to find something to either write with or write on. So if you're a typer and you take better notes when you're typing, if you are someone who takes better notes when you're handwriting, just really use this time to take advantage of the workshop and the primary components of the workshop, which are really going to be a lot of self-reflection. So you're going to do that. You're going to see some different prompts that I have. You'll do that throughout the conversation and the Q&A, but also like throughout the presentation. So write or type what resonates with you. When it comes to reflection questions, I really encourage you to take notes and to just pause and reflect on your own experiences and your own approaches with this work, because I'll be sharing also a little bit about my own. When I'm defining trauma, I'm going to be doing it at a fairly high level. And I really do this without medicalizing or pathologizing trauma. I'll be sharing a more social model of trauma, and then I'll also provide a short list of different types of traumatic experiences, minus the details. I'll also read an excerpt from a book about different individuals who experienced the same event, and that event is going to be a fire at an elementary school. There are many, many ways of thinking and talking about this topic. So there are a lot of different approaches to trauma, trauma-informed care, and even trauma-informed design. I'm going to focus on some of the, I think, the most interesting and emerging and promising practices that I think can really help us reimagine this work, especially with the work that we might do in public interest design and civic tech. I'll also be sharing some resources and some practices. It will not be an exhaustive list. We just don't have the time to go into all the things that I would actually love to go into. But so you'll get like a little bit of a sampling, and just want you to know we're just going to be barely scratching the surface with this very, very large topic. We'll also use my knowledge and we'll use your knowledge. So I encourage you to participate and be active in the chat. I know sometimes it can be a little distracting when you're trying to pay attention to someone who's talking, but build upon what someone might be sharing or what someone might be saying. Our time together is really, I always see this as like a mix of what might be new to you and or maybe refresher knowledge, about care practices and then just this understanding of trauma. So I encourage you to share in the chat like your approaches, your practices, various resources, things that you might know that are coming up that you want to share with others. So what we share is truly both my knowledge and your knowledge. I want to be very honest about our limited time. So when we only have 90 minutes together today, so we need to have a realistic expectation on what can be workshopped in that amount of time. My hope is that you walk away with a greater trauma sensitivity and definitely a greater awareness around trauma. But it is unlikely that you'll walk away as a trauma expert. I don't even consider myself a trauma expert, and I sort of I'm so deep in this content on a regular basis. If you have any questions, ask away. So I encourage you to ask questions in the chat. We'll have time, like I said, in the last 30 or so minutes to have what I hope is a robust Q&A conversation. You can come off of mute. You'll be able to speak if you want to. Again, you can also just type something in the chat and Hannah and I will field those things. So any questions, I really try to offer this up for any session that I do, especially the ones that are much more public. But any questions that we don't get to, like I will plan on providing a written response. So hopefully that is something that can go out to all attendees. This is a breakout room free zone. I say that with a little bit of like sarcasm. I think sometimes when you can get into smaller groups, it really can serve this important purpose for virtual sessions. So I'm not completely anti-breakout room. However, if you are an introvert, and I sometimes really do consider myself an introvert, or you just cannot stand breakout rooms, especially with people that you do not know, like you are absolutely in luck because we will not have any. So we're going to be staying together as a large group the whole time. When it comes to just how to show up for this, I really want to like kind of end on this note of show up in the way that feels best for you. So you can feel free to be on, have your camera on or have it off. So whatever is just makes the most sense for your time zone and where you might be and what you're doing. Take any breaks that you might need. Since we only have 90 minutes, we won't be taking a break. My only ask, and I know that I cannot enforce this, is that you truly just allow yourself to not multitask during this session. I see these things, these types of learning opportunities as investments in yourself. And so invest in yourself by engaging and listening. And I also consider this as part of your work. So I don't feel like you need to do any additional work on top of this. Okay. All right. So a little bit of getting to know me. So I'm a social worker, and as a social worker, I take part in a lot of different continuing education and a lot of self-study. And when I take part in any kind of workshop or training or webinar, I always want to know a bit more about the presenter and their background. And so I have found that it's very valuable for you to know who you're learning with and from, especially as there is a growing number of people talking about trauma and trauma-informed design. So I think it's important, that you know like who I am and who am I to even like talk about these matters. What kinds of knowledge give me any sort of credibility? Having a sense of these things will really help you better understand where someone, so not just me, but where anyone is maybe coming from. This also allows us to, I think, ease into this kind of content, and because talking about trauma it might be new or it can be a little uneasy. So sometimes there is apprehension, and it is very natural and very normal to want to self-protect, especially if we aren't up to talking about or hearing about trauma. I really emphasize like reflection and self-reflection, and I believe reflection is a true act of care, and it's a core element of having a trauma-informed practice. So reflection gives you an opportunity to consider your own experiences and how they might have influenced or are influencing and or shape both why and how you design. So added to this, just this in the spirit of ongoing and deepening self-reflection, I really think this is key. I often ask myself, and I've done this for many, many years, even before I was a social worker, but I really do often ask myself, like, why do I care so much about like this thing or whatever that thing is? And what is it about this that I want to change? And I also, in more recent years, I really have been thinking about what kind of a friend, colleague, just general like world citizen and ancestor do I hope to be? And it really has played a much larger role in how I practice and how I want to show up in doing this work. So I am Rachel. I know Hannah had a little bit of an intro at the very beginning, and I also really like to talk about things that are outside of like the work that we do. So outside of work, I am a mom. I am an aging indie rocker. I used to play in a bunch of some pretty good, it's like not so great like indie rock bands. I'm also a deep thinker. I really need to take the time to marinate on ideas and things that I might be like reading or that I'm listening to, or maybe even debating. I'm also a fairly terrible time optimist. I always think I have more time than I truly have. And despite all this, I'm still quite hopeful. And it's just sort of maybe I sometimes wonder if maybe that's part of my like my Midwestern upbringing. So I was born and raised in the Midwest in a state called Illinois in a two-parent working class household. I was a first generation college student, so I was the first one in my entire family to go to college and actually complete college and then go on to get a graduate degree. I had some privileges while I was growing up, but I have earned many more privileges over the last 25 years. I am married with one child, and I'm currently employed full time, and I am currently able bodied. My entire career. So at this point, it's like a few months shy of 25 years, which doesn't seem possible, but it is possible. But my entire career has been in either the nonprofit sector, the federal government, or higher education. I left higher ed in 2021, and that's when I dove like straight into the deep end with my own consultancy, something that I never ever thought I would do. And through that work, that's where I really support and I guide teams around the world on many of the types of things that we'll be talking about today. I care deeply about human rights and ethics, and this is really shown through almost every single role I've had since the year 2000. Like Hannah mentioned, I also currently work at the United States Digital Service, which is under the White House. I also think that acknowledging others, like who are both in and around this area of work, is a way of practicing for me like grounded confidence. So I am not the first person to talk about trauma or trauma informed care or even trauma informed design. There are a number of people in this space working every day to make our practices and our processes and our products more ethical, care focused, and trauma informed. So I really want to. This is going to feel like an Academy Award speech, but I feel it's really important to just name some of those people and to name them like in a recording. So I could not be doing this work without the support of the people that you see here. So Tad Hirsch, Andy Phillips, Mary Feuder, Kay McKercher, Jerry Scullion, Jenny Parker, Josh Kim, Martha Wilkes, Karen Cutright, Louise Clark, Kevin Shaw, the Veterans Affairs, a trauma-informed design community of practice, especially Liz, Tyler, Charlotte. I mean, there are just so many. The Design Justice Network and the Social Work Futures Lab. And then on top of that, just literally, truly, literally like hundreds of public service and civic tech workers just like you, who are working, I would say, both in and outside of, or maybe even adjacent to these spaces, who have just shown this dedication and this commitment to really caring about design in all parts of the world. So I want you to think about, I'm really trying to like both model and like share some things with you, but also like model like what this practice can look like. And the first time I really started like sharing a bit more about me outside of work, I felt like I was wearing a shirt that did not fit. But I've grown to be really comfortable with that because I think it's important for us to think about who we are outside of our work and to also really consider both what and who has influenced your practice so far. So think about these questions and just, either have those people, have those things like in mind and or like write them down. Like, this is just for yourself. It isn't something that you'll share. Okay, so I want to, before we get into some of like the crux of talking about trauma, I want to share some notes on both hope and care. Because the word trauma can be quite heavy for many people and for really many of us, I just want to offer some notes on both hope and care. So I'm going to start with hope. Hope really plays a pivotal role in design and in government services. A belief in hope can really strengthen our work in the ways that we may not ever be able to envision. If I did not believe that we could both positively and meaningfully change things, I would not be here today, or I wouldn't be doing this kind of work. So I truly am like quite hopeful that a group of people can really have can really significantly change things. A hopeful practice is also really honoring and meeting people where they are. So meeting people where they are is something that's often said in social work practice. This way of practicing hope is really central to, I think, acknowledging and really validating other people's experiences as well as your own. Growth and resilience and healing. These are things that when there's like more time or there's like just longer sessions or different kinds of conversations, I really like to talk about aspects of growth and resilience and healing. And I believe these things are in constant relationship with hope. So I believe we can commit to creating a world or the world that significantly reduces trauma, and to do so in a way that does not perpetuate harm or create new harm. The thing is, though, is that this will require us to have like a true like radical reimagination from the ways that we probably have been working for quite some time. Now, I want you to think about like what role hope might play in your work currently. Do you feel hopeful about the work that you get to do? And where is hope maybe like missing? Where can you cultivate that, or where can you maybe like nurture that as well? When it comes to care, so my trauma informed practice really goes beyond what I do, often as a researcher. Something that I think about quite often are cultures of care. So especially like in the workplace, like work cultures of care. Care is developed through the many seemingly small moments in everyday life. Care to me is not this huge pronouncement. It's not the grand gesture. It's not a declaration of what's right or wrong. It really happens in these very small moments. I think it's important for us to pay attention to standpoints of care. So care really should be looked at from various perspectives, so from the standpoint of the receivers of that care as well as the givers of that care. And when we have bad forms of care, which can be defined in a number of different ways, it can really deceive us into thinking that unjust things are okay. And so it makes me wonder, like, how do we challenge that? But also, how do we challenge that with care? We can build a culture of care in our services. And so something that I have right in front of me, it's between like my personal laptop and my work laptops, I have this image of cultures of care in these 14 different practices. And so I often think about like how can we integrate these 14 practices for a culture of care. And this comes from the Othering and Belonging Institute. So I strongly encourage you to follow their work. It's absolutely it's both groundbreaking and fascinating. But so if I ask this question, what does it currently look like to recognize, develop, share, protect, practice, cultivate, make, tend, honor, trust, listen, hold, nurture, and celebrate care? So those 14 words are the essence of those practices. I want you to think about like where is more care needed in your work or in your agency. This really might bring up some things that might be upsetting. It might remind you of experiences that were less than caring. So I want to focus more on less on a deficit and more of a where is more care needed, and how can you maybe cultivate that, both either for yourself, within your team, or within like your larger like agency or your organization. Before I start defining trauma and then talking about trauma-informed care and trauma-informed design, I want to share why it is so important for us to understand trauma and how it might be showing up in our work in government services. Many people interact with our different levels of government. So whether you're at the federal level, the state, maybe county, maybe something extremely local at the city level, people are interacting with our services at some of the most stressful and often the most vulnerable times in their lives. So from applying to various benefits like veterans benefits or Social Security, to public health, navigating financial aid or loan repayment for education, to experiencing natural disasters, needing access to food, various systems and processes that are related to asylum or other legal processes, as well as just navigating sometimes healthcare systems, finding affordable prescriptions, seeking out utility assistance. Like any of these interactions can be very overwhelming for individuals, families, and communities, even on their best days. So I find that when we hear the collection of all of the different types of services that any one of us might be part of an agency that is providing these, it really can give you pause when you think about the sheer volume of what we often are offering and the work that we are doing to try to make the access to those things much easier and the experience of that much more caring and less stressful and hopefully less harmful. I really think also, like, because these interactions can vary so much and people may sometimes, like, they're actively experiencing and they're carrying so much. I have found in practice this quote from Peter Levine to be so unbelievably true. So what he says here is trauma is perhaps the most avoided, ignored, belittled, denied, untreated, and misunderstood cause of human suffering. I mean, it almost like makes me like choke up a bit just to honestly to read it out loud and know that I'm reading it to a number of people. I think that if you are unaware of Peter Levine or his work, he is one of the most respected and trusted trauma practitioners and somatic practitioners, really in the U.S. but also around the world. And he really tried to, like, he drives home like some of this like these elements of this confusion and the misconceptions around trauma. So I love this quote. I'm also I feel challenged and I feel inspired to really to respond to this in a way that can really hopefully make this less of a misunderstood cause of human suffering. So as I start defining trauma, I want to focus on a definition that really moves us closer to a social model of trauma. When we look at this topic from a social and a structural lens, we can see how it really makes much more sense to the work that we're doing, especially in government services. I'm going to start to focus on the 3 E's in this definition. And the 3 parts of this definition is something that I've often used in a lot of other presentations. And it's attributed to a combination of Corinne Bell, Resmaa Menakem, and Bruce Perry. So the first part is that trauma is a response to anything that is overwhelming and that happens too much, too fast, too soon, and or for too long. The second part is that it is coupled with a lack of protection or support. It lives in the body. It might be stored as sensation, so like pain or tension, or it might be a lack of sensation, like numbness. The third part is that the context is critical to both acknowledge and understand that what may impact one person may not impact another in the same way. So one of the reasons why I love these different parts from these different practitioners and these different just very like respected practitioners around the world is that I feel like it truly gives us this breakdown of the event, the experience, and then the effect. And so another way that I want to just give a clear example of what the 3 E's look like is I want to share a very short passage. So now it's like if you feel like it's story time, but I want to share a very short passage from the book What Happened to You. And this came out 2 or 3 years ago at this point. It was co-authored by Bruce Perry and by Oprah Winfrey. And I know a lot of people who have read this book or they've listened to the audiobook. I'm going to give a quick plug for either. The audiobook version is Bruce Perry and Oprah Winfrey, and it literally like reads like a conversation, because the whole book is just a conversation of them, between them, back and forth. They have been very close colleagues for, I believe at this point, close to 3 decades, if not a little bit longer. Bruce Perry is truly a world-known expert in childhood trauma. He's one of the people who I go to often. I'm very inspired by his work, and especially the work that he does around like the neuroscience and the neurobiology of trauma. So to give you a bit of context, and if you have this book, I'm reading just a very small handful of paragraphs that are on pages 101 and 102. And the section starts off by Oprah asking, like, can you break down, like, what do you even mean by the word trauma? And so he shares a little bit, but I'm gonna like start kind of like midpoint of where he starts sharing a bit more of an example. And so what he says is, trauma has been hard for the academic world to define and therefore understand in its full scope. Part of that challenge is that bad event is subjective. So let's take an example. Consider, say, a fire at an elementary school. A veteran firefighter can walk right up to the flames and put them out, business as usual. In contrast, a first grader witnessing his classroom burst into flames will experience minutes of intense fear, confusion, and helplessness. This illustrates one of the key issues in understanding a potentially traumatic event. How does the individual experience the event? What is going on inside that person? Is the stress response activated in extreme or in prolonged ways? So then Oprah asks him or says in response, so in other words, because the internal experience of a given event varies from person to person, so does the long-term impact. So then Dr. Perry goes on and says, exactly. Any long-term effects are related to several factors, including the nature of your stress response, for example, arousal versus disassociation versus a combination of the two, as well as the intensity and pattern of that response. Imagine that while the first grader reacted to the fire in his classroom with terror, a fifth grader in a different part of the building didn't feel nearly as threatened. To him, the fire was almost exciting because he was further from the direct threat. He felt safe the entire time. So here we have 3 people in the same event, each experiencing it differently. And because each experienced it differently, each had a different stress response. Based on her years of experience and practice, the firefighter had a moderate activation of her stress response systems. The event felt predictable and it felt controllable. For her, it was a resilience building experience, not a trauma. For the fifth grader, there is a temporary activation of his stress response. In a week or so, the acute effects of this activation are gone. He's back to baseline, he's in balance, not traumatized. For the fifth grader, however, his stress response systems were highly activated. He will develop a sensitized stress response system. And so I cannot, out of all the things I have read, all the things I have heard, various things that I have said myself, I cannot think of a clearer example of what it really can look like for 3 different people to experience the same event and to have 3 uniquely different from one another experiences with that, or the effects of that. So let's get into like a little more like detail around this. I want to first talk about, how common is trauma? Like, you really might be wondering, like, well, like, how common is this? So the following statistic is from the National Council for Mental Wellbeing. It's actually from 2014. So this is a 10-year-old statistic. So back in 2014, it was estimated that 70% of adults in the United States had experienced at least one traumatic event in their lives. So if we adjusted this just based off of population numbers today, this would roughly be about 233 million people, like just in the US alone. Statistics for around the world are estimated at between 60 and 70%. So you can just imagine the multiple millions and millions of people that is. Trauma can stem from a number of different types of events or experiences. So there's a lot of debate on what is and isn't considered a traumatic event. And those types of experiences can really range like far and wide. But I want to share just a cluster of some that are much more common, and some that really don't always get talked about as they might intersect with some of our work. So childhood trauma, bullying, community violence, natural disasters, intimate partner violence, medical trauma, physical abuse, race-based trauma, refugee trauma, sexual abuse, sex trafficking, terrorism and violence, and then traumatic grief and loss. And this is literally a very small sampling of the types of experiences that are considered like deeply traumatic. Now, the other thing, because trauma and traumatic experiences are so common, I want to also share that there are many common and very normal and very natural reactions that can occur. So if we look at emotional first, like it can really like feel like this. So irritability, sadness, anxiety, depression, guilt, grief, fear, apathy, numbness, agitation, trouble forming relationships, or low self-esteem. Behaviorally, like how it can show up is like experiencing withdrawal, aggression, crying, worrying, risk taking, difficulty communicating or difficulty listening, blaming either yourself or others, and maybe like regressed behaviors. So things that maybe you haven't done since you were either a toddler or like a child. Some of the types of physical reactions that can occur include headaches, stomach aches, a racing heart, fatigue, muscle pain, disrupted or just interrupted sleep, changes in your appetite, and a heightened startle response. And then when we look at the cognitive aspects, like the way that it can manifest cognitively is difficulty processing information, confusion, having a hard time really concentrating, forgetfulness, having racing thoughts. You might have a preoccupation with the event or the events, or having intrusive thoughts and memories. So you may have witnessed some of these reactions in either like research. So if you're a researcher, a design researcher, and you've done a lot of studies, a lot of research sessions, like you may have seen like hints of or some explicit examples of some of this. But you also may have experienced some of this both yourself, or maybe you've seen this within your team or within others that are like that you're really close to, so friends and family. I want to also share how trauma does show up in our work. And this isn't exclusive to government services. This is actually fairly common across many workplaces. So here are some ways that trauma can show up in both teams and in our work in government services. These are just some of the things that practitioners have shared with me over the last few years. So historical and intergenerational trauma, vicarious trauma, organizational trauma, workplace trauma, feeling like there are experiences of re-traumatization that might be occurring, burnout and compassion fatigue, secondary traumatic stress, ethical dilemmas, exposure to injustice, a lack of support and resources, identity-based trauma, cultural trauma, digital trauma. I know quite a few people who, especially in tech, who are just on their role requires them to observe and take in a lot of information of like activity that's happening online. I think also moral injury is a really big one. Project related trauma. So it could be like the types of things that you're having to study or having to understand. And then, you know, in unhealthy and or toxic workplaces, there can also be these elements of feeling like you are invisible, or that contributions that you might be making, especially if you're speaking up, if you're challenging something, that that those contributions are maybe being erased. So these things may not be happening in isolation. Sometimes, like, many of these things are happening together. Trauma can really have this compounding effect on other things that we either have or that we might be experiencing in our lives as well. I'm gonna take a quick sip of water. So those previous few slides were quite a lot. And it's why I really started with talking about some notes of hope and care. One of the most hopeful approaches in response to the prevalence of trauma is really taking a trauma-informed care approach. Now, there are a number of iterations of trauma-informed principles around the world. The one that is most widely shared in the US and is commonly shared around the world is from SAMHSA, and that's the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. I'm really drawn to this set of principles because of my own background as a social worker. And these principles were really, as they were really coming into development and then starting to get shared, they were really, the target audience, if you will, were people who worked in healthcare, emergency responders, like people with backgrounds that are very much like mine. And so I have found that sometimes these principles, so like their words, I do think they make sense, and I think we can figure out ways to apply them in any of the things that we do, but they aren't always easily understood in design. And so I think this is where there are different individuals and different organizations that are really expanding on these principles and talking about them in a slightly different way, truly based off of the context that they work in, and or the population that they might be serving. So how can we take the essence of SAMHSA's principles and really try to adapt them in ways that make sense for our different contexts? So if we use the SAMHSA principles as a launch pad, I think that this is one of the ways that we could define what trauma-informed design and what a trauma-informed design approach might look like. So I'm going to define it here. So a trauma-informed design approach recognizes the persistence of trauma and further commits to not repeat or cause additional trauma through any government service experience. This approach is intended to shift and share power while addressing the trauma that the public and civil servants involved with the delivery of government services may carry. This means that we are respecting and that we are responding to the needs of those we serve, those we work with, and ourselves. By integrating trauma-informed care principles, government practitioners support the mission and help people restore a sense of safety, dignity, and self-worth in all aspects of the delivery of government services. I want to give some credit to two colleagues, like one being Kevin Shaw and another one, Amy Chenot. We were working on something within the federal government, and we were really trying to we were playing with this language, and it's like, how could we really define this in a way that might make sense at a particular agency? And so there were a bit more specifications that were added for that particular agency. And so I think that this is a strong definition of an approach and what that might look like, and something that I think could be adapted depending on where you might be working. Now, I also want to share an expansion of the principles and a bit of an interpretation of the principles. These visuals were created by Kevin Shaw, a friend and colleague, and he created these really based off of several conversations that we were having, and we were talking about SAMHSA's principles, and I was sharing with him that the more that I talk about this on a regular basis, the more that I realize that there are some principles that are missing, and that we might need to add new principles. So I've kind of kept this running list of different things that I feel are really important to this work and are just so necessary to really think about as part of this work, especially in this context of design. And so I'm just going to read through like the image here, just to really make sure that we're capturing these. So when we are listening to other people, we are really ensuring that and providing that confidence that people will be heard. With support, we are communicating that that people can get the help that they need. With trust, we are going to treat people both fairly and with dignity. When it comes to safety, we want to ensure that people feel safe or safe enough um, when they are interacting with us and the services that we might offer. When it comes to collaboration, it's really important to assure people that they are not alone, that we are there to help them along the experience that they might have with the various services that they might be needing to utilize. With choice, if there are any opportunities for us to give people choice and remind them that they have that, then that is just one of the most empowering things that we can do. When it comes to empowerment, we want to remind people that they are also capable, that they are capable of being able to navigate some of these experiences because we have improved them. When it comes to equity, we will, people will not be discriminated against. And with transparency, we assure people that they will get the information that they need in order to very gracefully and easily navigate through the services that we offer. At this point, we have covered quite a bit of a foundation on trauma, trauma-informed care, and trauma-informed design. So now I really want to start sharing some of what I think are some of the most promising like practices and tools and tactics. This is not an exhaustive list. This is just a little bit of a sampling of some of the things that you can use, that I definitely use in my practice. And so it'll just give you a bit of a taste of the types of things that can be, I hope, easily integrated into a trauma-informed practice in government services. This first one is a ways of working exercise. This is something that I have used with a collaborator, with my friend and colleague, Mary, on a couple of very serious and complex sensitive subject matter research projects that we've collaborated on. So if you're working on a project that has a very known likelihood of trauma, this is a really great exercise to do with your team before any of the work begins. So potentially like after a project has been scoped, but it could also be done before a project is scoped. But before any kind of a kickoff, before any kind of research that is happening, this is something that I think is really valuable to do. The way that this works is that everyone on the team shares their name, their roles. Sometimes we wear more than one hat on these teams. We share hopes, fears, the ways that we work, and the different wellness needs that we might have. So ways of working, an example of that could be at 3:40 Monday through Friday, I need to pick up my daughter from school. So I'm unavailable from 3:15 to about 4 o'clock for meetings, Central Time. A wellness need could be, I have a standing appointment on my calendar every week on Thursdays at 9 a.m. So you can trying to give you a sense that you don't have to share like extreme detail. You can share like a minimal amount of information, but share these things like with the people that you're working really closely with. And then to the right of the two like sticky images that you see is a template for we thought just more concretely reflecting on what might come up for you and what you might need. So this can help both you, your team, and your organization identify what other resources or support you might need. This can be done individually. So the way that Mary and I have typically done it, it's done individually. It isn't shared publicly. It's not put on like a Miro or a mural board. But sometimes we do open it up and we just have a little bit of an open conversation around it. But the resource ultimately, at least this part that's on the right side is really meant for you. And so you can choose to share certain elements if you feel like it's safe enough to do so. Okay. Another tool that I really like using in either workshops or trainings, sometimes talks or just teams that I might be working with are card decks. I I'm just trying to think of like the first time like I got like a design eccentric card deck and I was like, wow, like what am I ever going to do with this? Well, at this point, I have probably about 30 different sets of cards that are related to design, social work, or trauma. And the example that I want to share here is the model of care for co-design cards that was created by Beyond Sticky Notes. I'm clearly recovering from a nasty cold that my daughter and I both had. Excuse me. Okay, so K.A. McKercher is the author of Beyond Sticky Notes, and K.A. gathered a group last year to create an expansion pack based off of the original set of cards that were made a few years ago. So the one that you see here is one of the cards that I contributed to this deck. So this one is called Hold Without Absorbing. And then the subtext on the front of the card, it says, being present with compassion is a skill that we can all develop. How can we hold with care and not absorb or minimize others' pain? And so then when you flip the card over, there's either there's some text or there might be some specific practices, some specific things that either you individually or a small group or a team can do. So you can see here the text that is on this particular card. So I'm going to give you a second to read that while I drink some more water. Okay. Now I'm going to go ahead and read this too for folks who may be watching this or just like listening to this. So the back of this card, it says, there are times when our work might dysregulate or activate our nervous systems, and that can send signals that we might not have expected. In psychology practices, holding means that we are curious about emotions in the context that they emerge. And this is really kind of like a discovery and a practice that became a bit more well known in the 1960s from a psychologist named Donald Winnicott. Then the rest of the card, it says here, like, how can you be supportive and reassuring, but not invasive? I think that's one of the most often asked questions. It's like, how do I support people but not be invasive? Creating and nurturing a holding practice can show that you're available to others. And at the end, I share something from a friend and colleague, Melanie Call, where she said in I believe she said this in a LinkedIn post, she said, good holding can help us trust and create what's next together. So this card is just one of many. I think there's about 60 different cards, and I just see these as like practice cards that people can utilize. Okay, the next thing that I really want to share is having a scope of practice. There is more and more conversation that's happening around scopes of practice for designers, which I think is very, very exciting to see. But first and foremost, you might be wondering, like, what is a scope of practice? And it's really defined as it's the professional boundary that you work within that clearly communicates where you begin and where you end as a professional. So I'm going to share just a little bit about what that might look like for me as a social worker and as a designer. So some of the things that I am often thinking about with this dual disciplinary lens is adhering to a professional guidelines and a code of ethics and developing practices that fall within my scope. Familiarizing myself with the updates and the requirements for continuing education, as well as seeking out education or self-study on emerging and promising practices. The third point here is that just clearly defining my role. So that can include the different types of things that have supported my work or the people who have supported my work. Some of the things that I feel that I can respond to with a certain amount of like low stress or with ease. It might also include the types of things that I'm much more comfortable doing with a peer or a collaborator. Another aspect is that a scope of practice can also really give you clarity and give you this discernment on what are the things that you can do, what are the things that you cannot do, what are things that you don't do, and what are the things that you are choosing not to do. Those are all, there might be some overlap with some of those, but they're all like uniquely different. And I think like the grounded confidence that it takes to have this like this practice discernment on the things that I cannot, do not, will not, and choose not to do is I think really, really key. I've run some sessions on scopes of practice with different folks, and it's been very eye-opening for myself and as well as others as they really, just as you really think about like what are the things that I'm actually capable of, what are the things that I am limited in my ability because I don't have experience or expertise or an understanding of, fill in the blank. So this is I think this is like a really, really good practice for designers to have. So have you thought about your own scope of practice? Like there are some models that are out there. There's a lot of inspiration that's being drawn from professions and disciplines like social work, because this is something that is just expected for us to really do throughout our career. So think about like what are those things that you can do? What are you capable of doing? And what do you not do? So, one of those things for me is like is that I am not a graphic designer. So I've had people sometimes when they just hear the word designer, it's like, oh, Rachel, can you help me like do this thing? It's like, no, like I am not your gal for that project. But there are other things that I feel like I'm pretty confident in, or I'm really, really strong in, or I feel much more comfortable if I'm doing it with either a peer or a collaborator or a small team of people. But give this some consideration. So as we get closer to the end and starting to getting ready to transition to the Q&A, I want to share a list of things that have been foundational in building my own trauma-informed design practice. In our modern and very busy workplaces, some of these might sound like they're just a pipe dream, like there's no way I could do that. But I can assure you that these are examples of the types of things that will ultimately both support and sustain you while you are working in a trauma-informed way. So I'm going to read through these. The first one, so open up your calendar. So just like your calendar needs some breathing room. Reduce by 50% or cancel the meetings that you have scheduled. That could be a Slack message, an audio message, or even an email. I know that this is easier said than done, but I have been paying more and more attention to my calendar, probably since I worked at Veterans Affairs. And I thought that making it less stressful would be like just color coding it, and as beautiful as it looked with all the color coding, I was still really, really overwhelmed with the volume of meetings that easily could have sometimes been a message, a short conversation, a phone call, or an email. The second one is resist the false senses of urgency. Like there are many of these in our work in civic tech and design. Pay attention to where urgency culture is really creeping in your workplace. It used to be, I feel like it used to be like much more overt, and it feels a little more nuanced now. But define for yourself, your team, and your organization the differences between a false urgency and a true crisis, because there is a unique difference between those two things. There are times when our work is very much all hands on deck. We have a crisis situation. We absolutely have to shoulder up and figure out how to get through this. But that is not something that is happening every single day for many of us in the work that we do. The third one is debrief with a trusted peer. So if you've recently had a difficult research session, or you know that a certain government project is going to be emotionally challenging for you, talk about this openly with a trusted peer. Number 4, map out your scope of practice. So I just talked about this, but a scope of practice is the professional boundary that you work within that clearly communicates where you begin and where you end. What are you trained in? What do you still need to learn? What are you both willing and unwilling and choose not to do? Number 5 is create a code of care. So sometimes we might call this, I've seen this called guidelines, might be like ways of working. Sometimes it's called a code of conduct. But a code of care is something that is, I think, has its own flavor, and it really is a fundamental shift. I want to quote Joan Tronto, who is just an expansive researcher on care and care ethics. And she says here, like, care is both a practice and it's a disposition. Number 6, explore design supervision. So the practice of supervision is not new, but it might be unfamiliar in design. A practice of design supervision would allow you to explore and manage ethical dilemmas, your role and your responsibilities, and how there can be shared accountability. It can also allow you to learn from experiences. It can help you develop your intuition, have peer-to-peer critique, develop your career, and then notice and name your skills, your values, and your strengths. Seeking consultation. We cannot be experts in everything all the time, or maybe even like any of the time. So if there is a topic that your team is about to dive into and you just know nothing about, there is really no amount of quick studying up that is going to adequately prepare you for the many pitfalls that really lie ahead. So seek out consultation and guidance from subject matter practitioners. I've seen a growing uptick in this with different teams across all kinds of different agencies, which I think is really just important. I would also, I also want to include just people who have lived or living experience. They are also subject matter practitioners, so I include them in that part. The 8th thing is give yourself margin. So this is a sewing maxim, and it's something that I read from an artist, a creative, and an author, Stacy Bloomfield. And she talks about like leaving enough excess fabric to account for the potential mistakes. So if you give yourself the space and like that mental margin to actually reconnect with your values, your purpose, and your integrity, this will really help you stay in alignment with your true self. The 9th one, commit to a daily practice. I will never forget the day that a collaborator on a project related to understanding racism in the child welfare system said, and someone, her particular county in the state that she lives and works in, just had a uniquely different set of positive outcomes with the work that they were doing. And someone asked, I just don't understand, like, how are you doing so much better than like really the rest of us in this state? And so she shared in response, she said, look, my team, we talk about these things every single day. She's like, we make a commitment to a daily practice. And I just loved how she did not skip a beat when she said that. It was so honest and pure and truly genuine. So I think, another gem that I really want to share from Stacy Bloomfield is that she uses this phrase that practice makes pattern. So when you make small changes daily, you really will start to notice those differences and how you are able to show up for the work, for your friends, your family, your communities, and honestly, most importantly, yourself. A few more that I want to read, and then just a handful of slides, and then we're going to open it up. Taking time off, slowing down, and doing nothing. And I literally mean like do like the kind of nothing that allows you to zone out, to stare at a ceiling, like sit in the sun, to really give yourself this rest and this opportunity to quiet your brain and your nervous system. It is truly essential. I think about the times, especially when I was in my 20s and my 30s, that I just thought I could just work as much as what was necessary. I have learned in my late 30s and then into my 40s that is truly not physiologically sustainable. So think about what a practice of rest looks like as part of your overall practice. The 11th thing that I want to mention is start with accessibility. So the most promising trauma-informed design practices are starting with accessible, inclusive practices that are not afterthoughts or not done at the end. So always start with a practice of intentional accessibility. Expansion is good. So often individual designers start to lead a shift by deepening their own trauma awareness. And when we start to expand that maybe out to our team or to a department or a unit or at an agency level, we are really like we're scaling up. We're doing more than just scaling up trauma-informed ways of working. We're actually scaling deep. And I think that this is where like the secret sauce kind of is. But it often does start with one person at an agency to consider these other ways of working. So I want you to think about, so like as I like read through all those, like what are some of the practices that you would add? And what are just other practices that we all should add to that list? Okay, so that list could be like very, very long, but the 12 that I shared are the ones that I feel are most critical. And I feel like those are ones that can be done quite immediately. So a few closing thoughts and some ways to stay engaged. I hope at this point that there's a lot of knowledge about trauma that you've gained and that this is only the beginning or it's a continuation of your path towards having more care and trauma sensitivity in your work. If you're new to these definitions and these approaches, you might be wondering, like, how do I take like all of this, like what sounds like theory and actually translate it to what it means to do it in practice? So I want to just suggest that your best next step might be to identify the different ways that your current interpersonal skills are supporting both yourself and others. And really like envision like where is that like that cloud on the right? Where is it maybe like overlapping much more with the knowledge on trauma that you might have, or some things that you may have already known that I just helped reinforce? This slide here is an image of some of my favorite readings on trauma and healing and care. Again, it is by no means an exhaustive list. Like behind me are 2 of 4 bookcases in this space that I have that are just filled with design books, social work books, books about trauma, books about things that aren't even related to any of those things, but also inspire me to think and kind of like stretch my learning and understanding. So I just want to walk, very briefly through each of these so that you can just have a better understanding of these. Any one of these can be like easily found online with just a simple search. So the first one is in the top left corner, is The Future of Healing, Shifting from Trauma-Informed Care to Healing-Centered Engagement. And this is from Sean Genwright. This is a Medium article that he wrote several years ago, and it really is like an evergreen piece. It's a really, really good one. Below that image is an article that talks about the misconceptions and the misapplications of the original adverse childhood events study and research. This is a lesser known paper. It came out maybe within the past couple of years by the original authors of the initial paper on ACEs. So if you ever hear like ACEs or ACEs scores, that is referring to adverse childhood events. And it's referring to that original study from many years ago. In the middle is a book called Researching with Care, Applying Feminist Care Ethics to Research Practice. Someone who recently graduated from a master's program at RMIT in Australia shared this book with me, and it is absolutely excellent. In the top right corner is an image of a paper by Tad Hirsch. So he's someone who I named as someone who I'm very much inspired by and also supports my work. Tad is a professor at Northeastern University here in the US. And this paper, Practicing Without a License, Design Research as Psychotherapy, is something that I mention, I believe, every single time I talk about trauma-informed design. In this paper, Tad, he warns us about how design research can often mimic the therapeutic effects of therapy, and that design researchers really should consider an ethical framework that includes learning much more about trauma and trauma-informed care and ways that we can do our work and practice in a trauma-informed way. Something else that I've said many, many other times is that this is essential reading, and I feel like this should be like required reading for everyone. The last resource, but definitely not the least one, is this one in the bottom right corner. And this is from the World Health Organization and the United Nations. And it is it's about a report that they issued in, I believe it was early October of 2023, that gives this new global guidance on mental health, human rights, and both policy and legislation that could be uh, created to help support these things. This report from them, it really makes these very important suggestions on how and why we must be moving towards a more like social model understanding of trauma and having a trauma-informed framework for anything and everything related to mental health and human rights. So it's an amazing report. And the title of this here would not give you any indication of like the richness that is in this report. One last thing, and I'm going to share a link to this when I stop sharing and when I can see the chat. Both myself and a couple of colleagues, we've been working on a project and a survey to really just get a better understanding of practitioner experiences around design, research, and trauma. So I'll share this link if this is something that you might want to participate in. I definitely encourage you to participate. There is no limitation. You don't have to be just in the US. It's open to anyone in the world. So the last thing is, and before we transition to the Q&A, I want you to just think about what would it mean to achieve trauma-informed government services? Think about what would have to change, what would have to end, what would we have to implement, and what would it really achieve? So think about these things as I just logistically like transition to the Q&A here. I've got my contact information here. I'm not too hard to find online. There's only about less than a dozen DCUSs on the planet. So please do stay in touch, and let's transition to the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Rachel. That was phenomenal. I'm gonna just turn off the recording as promised.